Senior national security analyst Juan Zarate joins us now on the phone. Juan, Vice President Joe Biden told CBS this morning that there was no apology and that the State Department also said that no one apologized. But obviously, this newly released video from Iranian TV clearly shows the opposite. So what do you make of that?
Well, it seems clear that the administration wants to make it obvious that we are not providing a diplomatic apology at a geopolitical level. They may not have been aware of the video, which then raises some other issues, both with respect to the treatment of the sailors, whether or not this was a coerced statement, and whether or not it was actually lawful to videotape the sailors. And so it begins to complicate the picture quite a bit. But the administration clearly wants to demonstrate that there was no kowtowing to the Iranians. But with this video, that narrative begins to change and shift a bit.
This comes at a particularly delicate time, just days before the Iran nuclear deal is supposed to be put into place. How did that play into this whole incident?
Well, I think there were two dimensions of this. The first is clearly we've established channels of communication that we haven't had before. The long weeks and months of negotiations, certainly between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif, has created a relationship where you can get on the phone very quickly and try to diffuse something like this before it gets out of hand, as Secretary Kerry was saying. So that, in some ways, is a reflection of a developed relationship that comes out of the negotiation. On the other hand, the administration is walking a fine line here because the Iranian government, many would say the hardest line elements of it, have been pushing the envelope with respect to what they're doing provocatively in the region and with respect to the U.S. And so in some ways, I think the U.S. Didn't want this to be another episode where it appeared the Iranians were pushing the envelope, were trying to aggravate things, and would complicate the execution of this agreement, which for this administration is really the cornerstone achievement in terms of foreign policy, and has become really a gatekeeping function for its relationship in Iran, and some would say even the Middle East. And so the unfolding of the nuclear negotiation and how it's being executed really has become a defining principle and framework for the administration, and they didn't want this incident to get in the way.
Juan, let's break this down for our viewers who may be, when they see video like this, very provocative images of our U.S. sailors with their hands behind their heads, on their knees. One would assume that guns were drawn on them. There are a couple of things that I think we should make clear for our viewers. One, it's being reported that this capture, this interrogation of these U.S. sailors may have come from Iranians' Revolutionary Guard, which is the extreme right-wing group that basically controls the Iranian government. That's the first question that I want to pose to you. And then the second one is one that perhaps may be uncomfortable for some people to discuss, but the reality is if a ship of the Iranian Navy sailed close to our borders, what are the procedures, the maritime procedures, legal procedures that countries and navies have in place for situations like that, where you presumably, if that happened near our military installations or near our borders, we would also perhaps board that vessel and perhaps take into custody for some period of time those sailors. But I want to first talk about the Revolutionary Guard and the optics of the images that we're seeing here.
Yeah, the optics are awful because it in some ways is symbolic of the way that some in the region, in particular our Saudi allies, the UAE and others, have felt that the U.S. is really not sort of projected force and strength in the region. And this image actually will play into that narrative in that sense that the U.S. In some ways is getting pushed around and is kowtowing a bit to the Iranians. And I think part of this is the dynamic, as you indicate, Vlad, of what's happening within Iran. There are hardliners and, frankly, elements of the regime. We have to keep in mind, we talk about the spectrum within the regime. The regime is all hardline and revolutionary. The Revolutionary Guard and the Quds Force are the implements of that regime. And so many elements of that establishment are not happy with the nuclear agreement, aren't happy with rapprochement with the U.S., and certainly have appeared to be emboldened a bit in recent months to be more provocative and to be more aggressive. And so the images here may be a way for them to send a message to the U.S. as well as internally that they're going to continue to exert their force and capabilities, and certainly aren't going to be limited by any nuclear agreement. And so that's a challenge for the U.S. and the administration, which certainly wants to see this agreement succeed and wants there to be a new phase in the relationship with Iran. On your second point, it's a very good question, and I think you heard this from the Secretary of State and the State Department last night, which is to say, look, it's not unreasonable for a country to take into custody naval forces that are in their territorial waters, at a minimum to investigate, but certainly if there's a sense of threat to mitigate that threat by taking the sailors captive. There are maritime procedures, obviously, for how these types of incidents are handled. There's notification procedures. There's attempts other than boarding a vessel or even taking people into custody and taking them on land. But I think regardless, this will be seen, especially with the video, as a provocative act, regardless of whether or not it was justified under maritime practices. And in the context of what's happening with the nuclear deal, will be seen by some, in particular in the region, as the U.S. losing its strength and its ability to exert pressure against Iran.
And Juan, just quickly, explain for us what the U.S. The boats were doing in that region. And as I understand it, it's pretty easy to accidentally move into Iranian waters.
Absolutely. I think people need to just pull out the map, and hopefully you're showing the map currently of the waters there. The Straits of Hormuz are incredibly narrow. The Gulf itself has numerous islands. The sailors themselves were taken to Farsi Island, which is in the middle of the Gulf. It's Iranian territory. We have the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. We have enormous sort of naval capabilities and presence in the region with our allies and for our own purposes. And so we've got all sorts of naval activity happening all the time. And in those kinds of narrow waters where there's tension and also questions as to where the borders actually lie, there's always a potential for miscommunication and miscalculation. And certainly these kinds of incidents can happen. Keep in mind, in 2007, the Iranians took custody of British sailors, claiming that the British Navy had gone into Iranian territorial waters. It took 13 days to resolve that incident, caused a good deal of tension. The fact that the Iranians resolved this quickly, I think, is important because it did not allow the taking of the sailors to escalate the tension. But no doubt this video is going to raise the specter that the Iranians perhaps didn't treat our sailors quite as well, and certainly will give the perception that the U.S. Is not being as tough or as strong against Iran as we should be.
Yeah, especially since they released that video so quickly. I mean, clearly as a way to use propaganda to sort of deliver that message. Juan Zarate, always thankful for your analysis, sir. Thanks so much.